Welcome to Where Silence Writes. Here, stories don't begin. They awaken, slowly, softly, from between forgotten pages. This is a place where silence speaks louder than voices, where shadows remember, and candlelight can carry the weight of a memory. So, let the noise of the world slip away. Let the quiet speak. Tonight, let the house remember for you. It began with a silence that felt deliberate, not emptiness, nor peace, but a kind of held breath, the kind that thickens just behind the ribs of memory. The house had not been entered in decades, yet the air did not smell of disuse. No dust veiled the floorboards, no cobwebs claimed the corners. The house had remained exactly as it was, not preserved but remembered. Every surface held stillness with the precision of something unfinished. Light through the window pane did not fall by chance. It landed like recollection, the kind of light that knows where it's going and returns there. The structure stood in a clearing too round to be natural, as if the trees themselves had drawn back, not from fear but from reverence. Roots twisted away from the foundation as though unwilling to disturb what lay beneath. The path to the door had long surrendered to moss and leaf, but it remained visible, like a name one cannot forget, no matter how hard they try. Even the wind moved differently near the house. It slowed, not out of caution, but as if reading something. The house did not invite. It acknowledged. It did not guard. It waited. Its walls, stone-thick and wood-veined, exhaled memory and silence, a kind that did not echo but enveloped. The door did not resist. It did not creak nor yield. It simply opened, not with sound, but with suggestion. The moment one crossed the threshold, the temperature changed, not colder, but older. It was the kind of air found in sealed trunks and inside unfinished letters. Each step forward was softened by something unseen, as if time itself cushioned the intrusion. The floor did not groan. It listened, and with every footfall, the house seemed to remember a little more, not out of nostalgia, but necessity. The hallway was longer than it appeared from the outside. With each passing step, it extended not in space, but in implication. Inside, the furniture remained arranged in a language no one currently spoke. Chairs angled toward shadows instead of the fireplace. A mirror hung too high to reflect anything but the ceiling. The walls were lined with objects neither decorative nor functional, but present. Artifacts not of taste, but of memory. A cup without a handle, a key without a lock, a shoe too small for any grown foot. A faded book sat open on a windowsill, forever on the same page. Everything in the house belonged not to a past, but to a pause, a life set mid-motion, as if someone had left the room with the intention of returning, and never realized how long they'd been gone. A rug lay near the door, too clean to be untouched, yet too faded to be new. On its edges, subtle impressions remained, half-shaped footprints, as if someone had stepped there not long ago, and the floor still hadn't decided to forget. Above it, a coat hook without a coat. Below it, a shoelace, neatly coiled like something that had let go, or been left behind on purpose. Beyond the foyer, the corridor narrowed, not physically, but perceptually. The walls seemed to draw closer, not to trap, but to listen more intently, as if proximity were necessary for memory to sharpen. Framed pictures lined one side, but the glass reflected too much light to see beneath. Shapes could be made out, rooms, objects, possibly people, but no detail remained. They weren't faded, they were withheld, as if the house refused to offer faces to those not yet willing to be seen. Across from the frames, the wall bore scratch marks too symmetrical to be accidents, too shallow to be desperate, a pattern that hinted at intention, but not confession. A side table stood at the far end, holding a vase that contained no water, no flowers, only a single button, dark and unthreaded. Its placement was not decorative. It was precise, as if marking something forgotten that should never have been. The table had only 3 legs, yet it stood perfectly still, balanced, not by design, but by decision. The floor beneath it dipped slightly, as though the wood had given way once long ago and then thought better of it. Nothing creaked, yet everything communicated, if one knew how to listen with attention instead of expectation. To the left, an open doorway revealed a room that might have once been a study. No books, no pens, no desk, just an armchair facing a blank stretch of wall where perhaps a shelf had once been. A single shoe print remained near its front leg, angled just slightly inward. The kind of angle someone makes when they're about to stand, then change their mind. The curtains, drawn shut, pulsed faintly in the still air. Not from breeze, but from memory repeating its own gesture. On the floor, a rug lay askew, not the way time shifts things, but the way one interrupts themselves in motion and forgets to fix what was nudged. Near the end of the hallway, a stairwell descended, not down, but inward. The steps were carpeted in a pattern no one designed, only remembered. It shifted with the light, as though each footfall redrew its geometry. On the wall beside the landing, someone had once written something in pencil. The words were smudged beyond recognition, but the pressure of the handwriting remained. The indentations etched into the paint like a whisper that refused to fade. No one had tried to erase it. It had simply chosen not to be legible anymore. On the final step, a nail stuck out at an odd angle, unbent, deliberate, as if something had once been anchored there and torn away too carefully. The wall beside it bore the faint outline of a handprint, not in grime, but in memory, the kind left by repetition, not touch. Whatever had stood there had stood often. Just above the baseboard, a small cluster of tally marks had been etched into the wood, 21 strokes, uneven and hesitant, as if each one had been carved on a different day. They weren't hidden. They weren't obvious. They simply were. Like the rest of the house, they did not explain. They remembered. There was a basement beneath the house, though no plans had ever recorded it. The entry to it was neither hidden nor locked, just ignored. A narrow door, painted the same shade as the wall beside it, with a knob too cold for the room it lived in. It did not draw attention, but it waited to be noticed, and once seen, it could not be unseen. The hinges moved without resistance, and the darkness beyond did not welcome. It simply allowed. The stairs leading down were narrower than expected, with each step shaped slightly differently, as if molded by uneven memory, or by uneven descent. The ceiling lowered with each step, though the walls did not converge. It felt like moving into a thought not fully formed, a sentence that had never found its final word. The light behind from the hallway above refused to follow. The further one went, the more the air became quiet, not from stillness, but from attention. The darkness was not blind. It watched in ways that light never could. At the bottom of the stairs, there was no landing. The floor simply appeared beneath your feet, or perhaps had always been there, waiting for weight to give it meaning. The space below did not resemble a basement. It was too orderly, too still. Shelves lined the walls, but held no objects, only indentations where things had once been placed, long enough to leave shapes behind. A thin layer of fine dust covered everything, not as neglect, but as memory settled in time. A table stood at the center, round, unadorned, with 4 chairs that did not match. Each faced outward, toward the room's edges. Not a meeting place, but a place that had outlived meetings. On the floor beneath the table, a single circle had been drawn, not carved, not painted, just faintly present, a mark that appeared only when viewed indirectly, and vanished when looked at directly. In one corner of the room, the air was subtly cooler, not enough to chill, but enough to notice. The change had no source. There was no vent, no crack in the wall, no draft, only a sensation of space, of something having once stood there and left a vacancy behind. On the floor, the dust was less disturbed, but not untouched. A faint trail curved in a crescent, as if someone had once paced in half circles, over and over, without knowing why. And on the wall behind, a nail remained. Nothing hanging from it, nothing ever meant to. It was just there, waiting, perhaps, for a memory brave enough to return. Next to the nail, a patch of wall had been repainted, just slightly off in tone, barely perceptible unless compared directly. It formed no shape, hid no message, and yet it drew the eye. Not because of what it showed, but because of what it might have covered. Above the basement, the house seemed to shift, subtly, as if adjusting its posture. Not in sound or structure, but in presence. The air in the upper rooms grew heavier, not with moisture, but with attention. Windows that once reflected the outside world now held only the interior. Looking out, one saw only glass, and behind it, more room, more wall, more house. The rooms began to feel recursive, each one feeding into the next without interruption. The hallway no longer led from one part of the house to another. It led from one memory to the edge of another, each step not taken forward but deeper. And somewhere in that folding of space, the house became less of a building and more of a state of awareness. One room in particular seemed unchanged yet unfamiliar. The wallpaper bore the same pattern it always had, floral, faded, insignificant. But now the flowers seemed arranged differently, not repainted, not shifted, but reinterpreted, like music heard in a different key. A chair sat beside the window, facing a curtain that had never moved. On the windowsill, dust had gathered in a shape, not random, not placed, just a suggestion of something once laid there and forgotten. Not an object, a gesture, the imprint of pause. On the opposite wall, a faint stain hinted at something once hung there. A frame, a cloth, a coat. Whatever it was, the wall had not forgotten its weight, or its removal. The ceiling above that room creaked, but not from movement. It was the creak of something long settled, reminding itself it still existed. The sound came not from the structure, but from the memory of structure. Wood remembering tension, beams recalling pressure, and beneath that sound, in the floor, a vibration. Not felt, but understood. It was not a house settling. It was a thought being reconsidered. The air shimmered slightly in places, not from heat, but from suggestion, like the moments just before a word is spoken, but never is. The floorboards just beyond the closet bore signs of pacing, not footprints, but slight discolorations in a curved pattern, as if someone had once walked that arc 100 times without realizing. Each step must have been soft, repetitive, thoughtful, not in worry, but in waiting. Along the baseboard, a faint chalk mark, half erased, but still discernible in the right angle of light, curved downward like the beginning of a forgotten symbol. Not a letter, not a number, just the suggestion of intention left incomplete. And nearby, a single screw lay on the floor, not fallen, placed, facing upward, without rust, as though it had only recently been removed, or set down for use that never came. In that moment, the entire house felt like it was listening inward, not outward to the world, but inward to itself, as though it had reached a threshold not of space, but of memory, and something just behind the walls had stirred, not awakened, but remembered it had once been awake. Somewhere behind the wall, a faint ticking began, not from a clock, but from a place where time was once counted, not loud, not rhythmic, just present, as though memory had found its metronome. At the farthest end of the upper floor, a door waited, not locked, not hidden, just unnoticed, until the house remembered to let it be seen. It was narrower than the others, with a handle slightly lower, as though meant for someone smaller. The wood bore no grain, just a dull matte finish that seemed to absorb light. When opened, the room behind it gave no resistance. It unfolded like memory, slowly, not all at once. And what lay beyond was not a bedroom or a study. It was something less certain, less defined. A space suspended between purposes. Inside, the walls sloped inward as though the roof had once exhaled and never returned to shape. No furniture filled the room, only objects placed with deliberation, a single brick on the floor, a threadbare cushion, and a picture frame with no photograph. These were not decorations. They were references, symbols. Each carried weight but no label, meaning but no explanation, The floorboards here were silent, not out of sturdiness, but out of consent. They allowed passage, they allowed standing, but not forgetting. The air was dry, not with heat, but with waiting, as if even dust had paused in its settling. At the center of the room, a square had been drawn in charcoal, precise and dark, not sacred, not ominous, just confident. Within it, the floor was slightly discolored, as though it had been used again and again for a ritual not written down, but repeated from instinct. The space invited no action. It offered no purpose. It simply existed, as though it were enough. Along one wall, faint indentations suggested shelves once held books, but none remained. Only a single bent nail, and beneath it, the imprint of where a spine had leaned too long against wood, the memory of a memory. And just above the window frame, a name had been scratched, too shallow to read, but deep enough to remain. In the far corner of the room stood a ladder, short, unfinished, with only 4 rungs. It leaned against nothing, not tall enough to reach the ceiling, not stable enough to be climbed. But it was there, not forgotten, not recent, just present. Beneath it, a shallow indentation in the floor matched its shape, as if it had stood in that exact position for years, or had been returned there after being removed and returned again and again. On the wall beside it, a strip of the paint had peeled away in the shape of a handprint, stretched, elongated, incomplete, not placed, revealed, and just above it, a faint curve had been carved into the wall, a crescent too deliberate to be dismissed, too subtle to be explained. There were no clocks in the room, no markings of time, but somehow one knew. It had always been late here. Not too late, just late enough. And outside the window, though nothing moved, the sky had changed, not in color, but in depth, as though it had drawn closer, as though the house was no longer standing beneath it, but inside it. The journal reappeared on the table as though it had never left. Not placed, not found, simply present again, where it was always meant to be. Its surface bore no dust, though everything around it had gathered a fine layer of stillness. The corners remained sharp, the spine uncracked, as if it was untouched, yet its presence was heavy, not because of its weight, but because of what had been written, or perhaps what still waited to be written. The house did not gesture toward it. The air did not tremble, but there was no mistaking that this time. It was meant to be opened. The cover yielded without resistance. Not soft, not stiff, simply compliant. The first page remained blank. So did the second, and the third. But turning each one felt like waking something deeper. Not frustration, not fear. A tension without origin, like hearing your name called in a dream and not knowing whether to follow. Then, on the 4th page, a word appeared, not drawn by hand, but settled, as though it had always been there. Begin. Below it, no instructions, no preface, just an open space expectant, the kind of space that does not invite writing, but remembrance. The pen was already in the room, not beside the journal, but across the table, uncapped, upright, standing on its own tip, as if gravity had been momentarily suspended to allow its placement. No ink dripped, no surface marred, and yet it had already written. Not just words, but presence. The kind of presence that lingers when someone has left the room only a second before you enter. When picked up, it felt neither cold nor warm, only certain. The journal did not resist the pen, nor the motion. But the moment the tip touched the paper, the house grew quieter. Not in silence, in anticipation. The writing began, not with thought, but with movement. Words flowed, not invented, but retrieved, like pulling memory through skin instead of mind. The lines curved downward, not straight. The handwriting was not familiar, but it was personal, like meeting a version of yourself who had once lived differently. Page after page filled, not quickly, not slow, just precisely, as if the hand no longer moved for the body, but for something older than language. And when it stopped not from exhaustion, but from completion. The pen returned to standing. The ink dried instantly, and the journal closed itself. Softly, like a breath taken in reverse. No title appeared, no signature, just pages. Filled. When reopened, the writing was still there, but now the ink shimmered faintly in low light. Not metallic, not alive, just aware. Certain lines grew bolder when glanced at, then receded when stared into. The text did not shift, but the memory of it did. As though it had been read before, not by the hand that wrote it, but by the one that remembered why it had been written at all. At the bottom of the last filled page, a small mark had appeared, a circle unclosed, drawn with neither haste nor perfection. An opening without an end, and just beneath it space, not for more writing, but for recognition. The kind that arrives not through thought, but through the quiet that follows it. The kind that does not ask, but waits. And as the journal rested, closed, silent, still, it felt no longer like an object within the house, but like a part of the house itself. The air in the room did not shift, but the atmosphere had altered. The journal remained closed, untouched, but no longer dormant. Its presence now extended beyond its covers, like warmth radiating from a fire not yet seen. The table it rested on seemed more anchored, as if the weight of memory had pressed it deeper into the floor. Around it, dust retreated slightly, as though unwilling to settle too close. And in the silence, there was a new density, not loud, not sharp, just full. The kind of fullness that comes when something unspoken has finally been heard. The house responded not with creaks or whispers, but with alignment. Walls felt straighter. Doors seemed less arbitrary. The corners no longer loomed. They listened. Shadows held their shapes a little longer before fading. The stairwell, once merely a passage, now resembled a descent into a shared recollection, its steps holding more than gravity. On the walls, patterns in the wallpaper emerged faintly. Circles, arches, repetitions, not printed, remembered. Memory as architecture, thought as design. And where once there had been randomness, now there was rhythm. Beneath the window, the floor bore a pattern that had never been noticed. A series of shallow grooves, almost invisible unless touched. When followed, they did not lead in straight lines, but wove gently through the boards, intersecting in soft spirals. Not intentional carvings, but the kind of wear that emerges when a path has been walked over and over, not by feet, but by presence. The wood remembered being waited upon. The space knew the weight of patience. And in that knowing, it had softened, absorbed, held. Above, the ceiling bore a singular crack, small, curved, branching off in 3 directions. It did not speak of damage, but of decision, as if once, long ago, the house had chosen to shift. Just slightly. Enough to remember something beneath it. And now, with the journal sealed once more and the ink absorbed, the crack had realigned with the grooves below. The house was not mended. It was configured. Not repaired. Revealed. And somewhere, within the walls, the memory of a name stirred. Not spoken aloud. Not written. But near. Closer than language. Waiting only to be remembered. Behind the bookshelf, once fixed, now subtly ajar, there was no hidden passage, no stair, no secret room. Only the suggestion of displacement. The wall behind it bore no different color, but it breathed differently. The air there was cooler, not with draft, but with distance, as though the wall remembered being further away once, or remembered something that once leaned against it. The floor in front of it creaked when no one moved. Not always, just enough to be noticed, just enough to remind. Near the baseboard, a hairline split in the paint curved upward like a question, hesitant, unfinished, waiting, not damage, not decay, a punctuation of uncertainty, and within that small curve, a fleck of red paint remained from an earlier layer, one no longer visible elsewhere in the house. The color was familiar in a way that caused the heart to pause, not from recognition, but from inheritance. The kind of familiarity passed not through memory, but through presence, like finding your shadow where you hadn't yet walked. There was a mirror in the hallway that had not reflected properly for years, not broken, not cracked, just displaced. It hung where it always had, but what it showed never quite matched what stood before it. Angles shifted, light bent differently, faces appeared tired when passing by, even if they had been rested moments earlier. And now, after the journal had closed and the house had aligned, the mirror began to shimmer, not brightly, not visibly, but inwardly, as if it had become less about seeing and more about recalling, less about reflection and more about return. Its surface darkened slightly at the edges, forming a soft vignette, like memory closing in. Within that frame, shapes began to persist, not as images, but as intentions. Faint outlines of furniture no longer in the hallway, the suggestion of a hat once hung. The echo of footsteps paused just before a decision. The mirror did not invent these things. It remembered them. And the hallway responded in kind. The floor beneath grew quieter. The air slowed. Time, just for that stretch of corridor, became contemplative. Not frozen, not rewound, just considerate. Outside the mirror's reach, the house pulsed gently with something akin to recognition. Along the stairwell, a banister that had long been chipped seemed less so. Not restored, but accepted. At the base of the stairs, a coat rack that had never held anything now bore a single hook bent forward, empty, but with purpose. And beside it, the wallpaper had begun to lift at the corners, curling not from age, but from invitation, as if something underneath, something covered long ago, wanted once more to be seen, or needed to be touched. And the room at the end of the hall, once rarely used, now felt central, not in position, in weight. The door to that room had no lock, yet always felt like it waited for permission. Its hinges made no sound, but memory suggested they once had. Along the edge of the frame, faint indentations in the paint hinted at hands, too small to be recent, too deliberate to be accidental. The kind left by someone who had paused, not in fear, but in reverence, as if the threshold had meaning, as if crossing it required remembrance. Inside, the ceiling bore a small ring of discoloration, neither water damage nor paint flaw, but the ghost of something circular once hung there. A lamp, perhaps, or a charm, or a child's mobile. It held no detail, yet suggested movement long past. Beneath it, the room felt centered, like a breath held in stillness, not because something was about to happen, but because something once had. The rug shifted slightly again, just enough to reveal a crack in the floorboard beneath, and within that thin line, something gleamed, not bright but certain. Beneath the lifted rug and the faint glint in the floorboard, the house held something not buried, but held. The crack was narrow yet deliberate, an opening that did not spread, did not grow. It waited. When touched, the wood did not splinter or shift, but offered a texture different from its surroundings, smoother, polished by time or touch or repetition, the kind of surface worn not by neglect, but by familiarity, a place not hidden from view, but overlooked by habit. The gleam was not metal. It was softer, almost waxen, and curved, not round like a coin, but oval, like a seal pressed too gently to be read. Within that sliver of shape, a line ran through its center, barely raised but firm, like the edge of a door that had never been opened. Around it dust refused to settle, not from wind but from memory. And just beside it a faint scent lingered, old paper, dried flowers, ink that had not touched a page in decades. The scent did not travel. It stayed in place like something sacred or stubborn. Elsewhere in the house, something adjusted. The window panes did not rattle, but realigned. The wind outside, though calm, seemed to hum, not through cracks, but through chords. The rooms breathed in time with one another, no longer isolated spaces, but organs in a living structure. From attic to foundation there came a tension, not heavy, not anxious, but alert. The kind of alertness a house develops when it expects return. Along the baseboards, heat moved, not warmer or colder, but steadier. Purposeful, the kind of shift that precedes a voice, even when no one is there to speak. And in that moment, the journal, though closed, took on weight again, not physically, but in presence. The table beneath it bent ever so slightly, not from gravity, but from acknowledgement, as if the journal had listened to what the house remembered, and now prepared to respond. The crack in the floor did not open further, but it deepened, not in depth, but in meaning. And for the first time, the silence of the house did not feel empty. It felt full, as though something had just been asked. And now, something waited for an answer. Near the fireplace, long unused, a fragment of ash remained, not from recent burning, but from preservation. It had not fallen. It had stayed, resting at the edge of the hearth, pale and intact, as if waiting for the moment it would once again matter. Above it, the mantel bore no clock, no portrait, just space. A space that had once held a shape, the outline still faintly visible in dust patterns, in wood lightened by shadow's absence. The room remembered something had stood there, not tall, not wide, but known, the kind of object that holds more memory than purpose. A draft passed through, not cold, but precise. It moved only through the center of the room, brushing neither wall nor ceiling. It did not stir the curtains, it stirred awareness. And with it came the feeling of eyes, not watching, but acknowledging, not from outside the house, but from within it. And as the glint in the floor and the journal on the table both held still, the house seemed to listen inward once more. The floorboard with the glint did not open. It yielded, not upward, but inward, not as a hatch, but as a breath, shallow, precise, and held. Beneath it was not a compartment, not a cavity, but a depression lined with velvet that had long since lost its color. In its center rested a stone, not polished, not carved, but smooth in a way only memory could shape. It fit the hollow precisely, as if it had grown there. The house had not hidden it, it had kept it. And the moment it was revealed, the light in the room grew softer, not dimmer, but quieter. The stone bore no markings, no initials, no cracks, but its weight was unmistakable. Not in the hand, it was light to hold, but in presence. Like holding a promise not made by you, but entrusted to you. It radiated no heat, yet warmed the air around it. Its surface smelled faintly of minerals and rain, and when lifted from its place, the depression beneath did not echo emptiness. It sighed, a soft release of something not trapped, just waiting. The journal remained closed, but it too responded, its corners curling ever so slightly, not from humidity, but recognition. Elsewhere in the house, rooms not yet visited stirred, not with movement, but with recollection. The closet under the stairs held a faint draft, not from air, but from absence. The cellar door, untouched for years, pressed slightly outward, not to open, but to remind. Even the attic, dark and insulated, seemed to exhale. And in each space, the same echo, not footsteps, but an impression of presence, as if the house itself had begun to remember all at once and could not keep the thoughts in order. Hallways curved subtly. Light changed direction. Doors aligned differently than before, not dramatically, just enough to be noticed. And yet, none of this brought fear, only a sense of returning, the kind of returning that does not require a destination, only the decision to walk. With the stone now resting on the journal, and the house no longer still but attentive, something final began to take shape. Not a revelation, not a secret, but a pattern. The house was not telling a story. It was the story, not built to shelter, built to remember, and now. It no longer remembered alone. Near the base of the stairwell, light began to move without a source. Not cast, not emitted, just relocated. It slid along the edge of steps, curled around corners, and paused at doorways. It did not illuminate. It revealed. The kind of revelation not meant for eyes, but for memory. At the kitchen door, the rusted hinge tilted imperceptibly, as if it too had once been asked to listen. On the far wall, a hairline crack drew a line straight through an old nail hole, connecting nothing, yet holding meaning. The stone on the journal remained still, but the house no longer did. It leaned inward, not structurally, but intentionally, as if folding around a center long forgotten, not collapsing, but remembering how to hold. And in that moment, the journal opened, not by hand, but by invitation. The page was blank, but within the blankness, a shape began to form. Not ink, not words, just weight. And within that weight, silence. Not empty, but full. A silence that knew its name. The silence that followed was not the end of sound, but the beginning of listening. It did not feel like stillness. It felt like a tension. The page remained blank, but not empty. It pulsed faintly, not with light or color, but with recognition, as if the very act of opening had summoned something unspoken to the surface. The stone, still resting on the journal's edge, did not move, and yet everything around it reoriented. The room leaned. The air bent, not in architecture, but in memory, not to collapse, but to return. The journal did not write. It received. Not words, not images, but weight. A weight made from things never said, from moments never kept, from choices never made but always known. It was a kind of gravity, gentler than truth, heavier than regret. The house accepted it, not with submission but with relief. The floor did not creak, it inhaled. The walls did not shift. They paused, as if all the spaces within had finally reached the same moment. Not synchrony, stillness, not echo, understanding. Somewhere in the attic, a beam cracked softly, not from stress, but from release. A tension unmeasured, but long endured. Dust rose, not in clouds, but in lines, like forgotten handwriting stirred by breath alone. In the cellar, coldness lessened, not warmth, but allowance. The kind of loosening that happens when something is no longer withheld. At the window, the glass grew clearer, not by cleaning, but by memory being scraped away. Beyond it, the world was the same, but the way the house saw it was not. And at the center of it all, the journal remained open to that blank page, still unwritten, still full. The stone rested without pressure. The light dimmed without darkness. No new page turned, no line formed, but the house knew. This was not waiting. This was remembering how to be a vessel, remembering what it meant to hold more than walls and beams. It had never asked for meaning. It had never needed witness. But now, with silence shaped like understanding and weight shaped like return, it was ready to begin. The air around the journal thickened, not with smoke, not with dust, but with memory pressed into atmosphere. It had no scent, yet it evoked seasons. It had no shape, yet it suggested thresholds. Spring rain on stone, autumn wind through dry curtains, winter silence beside a bed no longer there. The room held these not as memories, but as residue, and that residue gathered at the corners, folded into the grain of wood, settled into the grooves of time not counted by clocks, but by return. At the edge of the rug, a single thread curled away from the weave. It did not fray. It pointed toward nothing in particular, just the space between spaces, the kind that draws attention without asking for it, like a glance across a room that finds only stillness, but cannot shake the feeling of something left behind. The stone did not tremble. The journal did not turn. But the house did something rare. It breathed, not in, not out, but inward. And that breath, though silent, was the sound of memory finding a shape. There was a hallway at the back of the house that no one had entered for years, not because it was locked, not because it was hidden, but because it asked not to be. Its length was modest. Its walls bore no paintings, no paper, no marks of use, and yet it was heavy with presence, the kind of presence that bends time, not forward or back, but sideways. The floorboards beneath were unwarped, the air unstirred. But to walk down that hallway, even in thought, was to press into something older than movement, older than choice, older than... As the house leaned inward, that hallway responded, not with invitation, with alignment. Light did not touch its walls, shadow did not gather, and yet everything in the house oriented toward it, as if gravity had found a new center. At the threshold of the corridor, the rug from the journal room ended precisely where the hallway began, not by design, by memory. And beside that threshold, a notch in the floor revealed a pattern, circular, faint, almost erased. It matched nothing in the house, and yet it belonged to all of it. A signature not of a person, but of the structure itself, as though the house had once been marked and had never forgotten. Within the corridor, the silence held a different weight. Not absence, but layering. The sound of pages turning in a room long sealed. The hush of fabric left untouched in a wardrobe no one opened. The echo of a door that had never been closed, yet was never found again. These were not hauntings. They were sediments. Time, layered not in sequence, but in repetition, like water passing over stone, not to wear it down, but to remind it of shape. The hallway did not lead. It remembered, and to follow it was not to move. It was to be drawn. At the far end of the hallway, there was a window. Small, square, dull. It showed nothing but a blank wall of the neighboring house, and yet what it reflected inward was something else entirely. The room behind it, the one from which the journal had been taken, appeared in its glass, but not as it was, as it had been. Shadows in different corners, a chair once by the wall, a figure leaning, indistinct, toward something not yet opened. The reflection did not flicker. It waited, and the hallway exhaled. Near the window, the floor dipped slightly, not from damage, but from repetition. A single spot where weight had once rested often. A foot, perhaps, or a box, or a decision. The wood bore no stain, no scar, but held that shallow curve like a breath not fully exhaled. Dust did not settle there. It hovered, and above it, on the wall, the faintest discoloration suggested a shelf long gone, and with it, whatever it had held suspended between usefulness and reverence. And the air here felt older, not musty, not stale, but aged like paper sealed in a drawer. It carried the hush of choices never spoken aloud. Along the ceiling, a spider's web trembled without motion, as if catching only memories. And in that quiet suspension, the hallway felt no longer like passage, but like promise, not of what came next, but of what had once almost happened, and still might. There was a stair just beyond the hallway, steeper than most, narrow and silent. It descended not into the cellar, but into something older than purpose. It did not creak. It did not sigh. But each step downward felt like stepping out of sequence, as if the body moved forward while the mind folded inward. The air cooled, not with temperature, but with age. It pressed gently against the skin like forgotten linen, and each step recalled not where one had been, but where one had paused. At the bottom there was no door, just an opening framed by stone once meant to hold a frame. The walls beyond it curved, not symmetrically, not with design, but as if shaped by the memory of people standing too long in place. The floor was not flat. It sloped gently, almost imperceptibly, toward a center no light revealed. The space bore no furniture, no markings, no evidence of use, and yet it was used, not recently, not physically, but often, by something unrecorded, the kind of use that leaves no trace except necessity. In the far wall, a shelf carved from the wall itself held a single object. It was not a book, not a box, not a sculpture, but it held shape the way an absence holds breath. Its edges were not sharp, but defined. Its surface not reflective, but known. Looking at it summoned nothing to mind, yet suggested something had already been understood. It did not call. It waited, like the journal, like the hallway, like the house, and in its waiting, it gave form to the silence, not as emptiness, but as agreement. Above, the journal remained open, still turned to the blank page, still marked by the weight of the stone. The house did not move, but it listened, and the room beneath it listened in return. The air between them stretched, not like fabric, not like distance, but like memory shared between two halves of a sentence, not spoken, not even written, just held. And in that stretch, something passed through. Along the curved wall, a pattern began to emerge, not carved, not painted, but formed from the way dust had refused to settle. Faint arcs, interrupted circles, a language of outlines only memory could speak. The lines meant nothing when stared at, but carried the weight of familiarity when glimpsed sideways, like handwriting in a dream. One curve aligned with the shelf, another echoed the angle of the stairs above, and between them, a space formed. Not a symbol, but a pause. The air near the shelf cooled further, but not from absence of heat. It cooled in the way water becomes still just before freezing, not deadened, but alert. Even the walls seemed to inhale, and in that held breath, something passed, not sound, not light, but a kind of recognition. The object on the shelf did not glow, but became clearer, not more visible, more undeniable. And for a brief moment, the entire space held together like a thought almost spoken, but better left remembered. Somewhere above, beyond wood and dust and layered silence, the journal remained open. It did not shift, but the room around it did, subtly, like a thought reconsidered. The light in the ceiling corners withdrew just slightly, not as retreat, but as deference. Beneath the floorboards not far, the shape within the stone room echoed back. Not a sound, not a vibration, but a rhythm. One the house had always known, even if it had forgotten how to listen. The object on the shelf remained untouched. Yet, in its presence, the dust around it began to lose form. Not falling, not dispersing, but softening into suggestion. Shadows no longer clung to the corners. They pooled gently beneath the arch of the ceiling, and from that quiet gathering, a memory took shape. Not visual, not audible, but spatial. The memory of someone standing there, facing the shelf, not to take, not to leave, but simply to witness, as if witnessing was, in itself, a function of the house. The walls surrounding the shelf warmed, not in temperature, but in color, or the suggestion of it. Pale amber, like paper aged in a drawer, layered over time with the scent of thought. The room no longer felt hollow. It felt paused, as if time had taken a breath but had not exhaled. And the floor, curved, deliberate, and bare, reflected no light, but gave off the sense of reflection, not like water, not like glass, but like memory pressed thin and wide, waiting to be walked across without ever being stepped on. Then came the flicker, not of flame, not of light, but of alignment, as if all the thresholds in the house, doorways, stairwells, glances between rooms, had adjusted together, so gently they did not shift. They remembered, and in that moment, the object on the shelf did not change, but the air around it did. It held not presence, but recognition. The kind of recognition that needs no introduction. And far above, the journal waited without waiting. To the right of the shelf, a faint depression in the wall suggested a once-present sconce, now gone, but not forgotten. Its outline remained not in shadow, but in balance. The room held itself around that absence as though it were a still active anchor. And from the ceiling above, a single crack descended, not jagged, not sharp, but deliberate. It traced the path of something once suspended there. A lantern, perhaps, or a voice. Beneath the shelf, The floor bore one irregularity, a slight rise, no larger than a palm, smoothed by time, not feet. It caught no dust, and standing over it gave the sense of standing on something. Not sacred, not forbidden, but significant. The kind of ground one doesn't notice until the stillness reveals it. From there, the shelf looked different, not closer, not clearer, just more certain, as if it had always been waiting to be seen from that angle. And in that certainty, the house shifted again, not in wood or air, but in understanding. And above it all, the journal waited not to be read, but to be remembered. It needed no reader, only resonance. And in that moment, it had both. The resonance deepened, not louder, not sharper, just more. As if the house had passed from remembering into recognition, and now recognition was turning into response. The journal remained open, the page still blank, but the blankness no longer felt passive. It pressed outward, not to fill space, but to shape it. The stone resting on its surface no longer lay still. It did not move, but it hummed, not with sound, but with return. The kind of return that does not retrace steps, but restores weight. Walls that had once been silent now carried tone. Not voices, not echoes, but tonalities. Each grain of wood held its own note, not as music, as memory. The sound of furniture being placed long ago, the whisper of curtains settling after a storm, the hush of footsteps made by people who no longer passed through. The entire house vibrated, gently, subtly, as if aligning with a frequency it had always known but had forgotten how to hold. This was not haunting. This was tuning. Beneath the journal, the table grew warmer, not by heat, but by presence. Its surface, long dulled by time, now reflected light in strange directions. Not mirrors, not gleams, but patterns. Swirls that had not been carved, yet were there. As though something beneath the varnish was rising, remembering how it had once been touched. The corners of the table softened, not in shape, in feel, and where dust had settled, it now pulled inward, toward the center, as though memory had mass, and was collapsing into form. The windows no longer looked outward. They did not fog or darken. They simply no longer reached past the house. Each pane of glass became a wall, not of boundary, of focus. The house no longer needed to gaze outside itself. It had begun to listen entirely inward, and in doing so, it stirred more deeply than it ever had in its waking life. Not to reveal a secret, not to unlock a truth, but to settle, to come into itself, to finally hold everything it had always contained, without hesitation. Along the walls, seams in the paint began to align, not cracking, not splitting, but revealing continuities that had always been there. The layers of repainting, of redecoration, of years stacked upon years fell into agreement. The patterns beneath were not designed. They were remembered. Long-lost borders of wallpaper long removed. Nails once placed with care, now filled but never forgotten. Each fragment of change resolved itself into a larger cohesion. The room was not returning to an older version of itself. It was becoming all versions at once. And above, at the highest corner of the room where no one looked, a pulse gathered. Not a light, not a sound, just a concentration of presence, like the first breath before a name is spoken. And in that space held just beyond reach, the house drew a single, inaudible conclusion. Not in language, not in story, but in being. It no longer waited to be understood. It understood itself. And in that stillness, the journal breathed, not as paper, not as story, but as memory, finally unhidden. There was no sound, not even the breath of the house that had stirred so softly before. The stillness now was complete, but it did not feel like absence. It felt like a moment, just before clarity. The journal remained open, its page as blank as before, and yet more resolute. No words had formed, and none needed to. The house had stopped searching. It had begun inhabiting. inhabiting not space or structure, but memory itself, not events, not images, but the form of memory, its curve, its breath, its weight. The air thickened, but not with heat or weight. It thickened in the way a dream lingers just before waking, when symbols and space melt together, indistinct but certain. Walls once familiar lost their hard edges. Corners no longer pointed. They suggested. The ceiling bent gently as though bowed beneath the gravity of thought, and in that space the journal was no longer an object. It was an aperture, a place where memory was not stored but entered, not by footsteps, not by intention, but by surrender. Above the room, the attic did not shift, yet it changed. The dust had stopped moving, and in doing so, had begun to glow, not with light, but with patience, as though each particle carried a trace of something long asked and long unanswered. Boxes lined the walls, sealed, untouched. But now, they listened. Their silence was no longer passive. It was devotional, a silence that bore witness, and beneath them, the floorboards pulsed faintly, not with movement, with recognition, the kind that does not need proof, the kind that has waited through decades of forgetting, through seasons of emptiness, simply to be remembered by nothing more than presence. Deep below, where no rooms had ever been drawn into blueprints, the foundations held still, but even the stone had begun to loosen, not crumble, loosen, as if the pressure of being forgotten had finally begun to lift. The house had no voice, no face, no name, but in every layer, plaster, timber, ash, bone, it carried one truth. It was never meant to be just shelter. It was meant to be witness. And now, it was no longer remembering the people who had passed through it. It was remembering itself. In the center of the house, where no room had ever formally existed, space began to fold, not collapse. Fold, like cloth once worn, then pressed flat by time, now drawn gently inward by memory. This space had no name, no function, no furniture, but it had been felt, always, by those who paused without knowing why. It was the pause at the foot of a stair, the hesitation before turning a corner, the breath held when no wind moved. That space now stirred not with motion, but with attention. It had always been waiting to be noticed, and now it was. From that center, threads extended, not literal, not visible, but unmistakable. They traced not walls or beams, but meanings, from journal to table, from attic to cellar, from hallway to heartwood. And where they crossed, the house grew more than structure. It grew shape, not architectural, existential. It was not merely standing, it was holding. Holding all that had passed, and all that might still return, not to live, but to be known. Not all structures are built to contain. Some are built to remember, and some, very few, are built to do both until the boundary between containment and memory vanishes entirely. This house had begun as walls and warmth, beams and breath, but now it was shifting into something older than architecture, older even than memory. It was becoming presence, the kind of presence that does not stand in time but bends it, not backward, not forward, but inward. The journal remained open, but its page had become translucent, not in the literal sense but in essence. The blank space shimmered faintly as though it no longer waited for words but was the word itself. The idea of inscription had dissolved. There was no more need to write. There was only to be written through. The table beneath did not bear its weight. It absorbed it. Beneath that, the floor no longer supported. It echoed, and not with noise, with belonging. A resonance that stretched beneath the house and into the land beneath it, into layers of soil that had once been touched, once been chosen, once been home. Every surface in the house began to yield, not collapse, not decay, but yield, like a breath long held that now exhaled, slowly without sound. Wallpaper faded and brightened in equal measure. Floorboards lightened, not in color, but in burden. Even the air, thick with meaning, loosened its grip. This was not release. It was readiness. The readiness of a place no longer hiding, no longer containing, but inviting. Not people, not footsteps, but return. The kind of return that does not open doors or stir wind. It simply is. And somewhere, beneath the center of the house, not below, but within, a presence stirred. Not a ghost, not a memory, not a soul, but something that had watched all of them pass through and had never spoken. It did not rise. It did not approach. It only awakened, not from sleep, but from stillness. And in that awakening, the house drew in its breath again, not through airways or windows, but through memory itself. It inhaled everything it had once held, and then, quietly, it waited. The waiting was not passive. It was an act in itself, a kind of listening beyond hearing, a stillness so complete it circled back into movement, not through space, but through significance. Beneath the walls, the house threaded its knowing outward, into the trees once planted beside it, into the paths once trodden and now vanished, into the hands that once built and the hands that had forgotten they ever touched it. Each thread returned, not as information, but as weight, not heavy, just undeniable. In the shadows of stairwells and the seams of doors, something shimmered, not visibly, but undeniably. The edges of the house no longer held things in. They held things together. What had once been a separation between inside and out now became communion. The wind no longer passed through the chimney. It paused. The light from outside no longer fell on floors. It met them. And in that meeting, there was no border. There was only the quiet certainty that this house no longer stood in the world. It knew the world. There comes a moment in all awakenings when what once was hidden no longer wishes to be found, because it no longer feels lost. The house had arrived at such a moment, not suddenly, not with drama, but with a softness that only deep memory can produce. It no longer braced itself against the future. It no longer defended the past. It simply existed as a passage, not through space, through resonance. Time moved differently now, not faster, not slower, just wider, as though all its rivers had chosen to flow through this one place, this one silence, where a journal rested open to a blank page that had never needed ink. Somewhere in the grain of the floor, a shift occurred, not a creak, but a deepening, not downward, inward, a center within the center. Beneath the wood, beneath the stone, beneath the soil itself, the idea of the house had settled, not as memory, as intention. This was not about the people who had lived here. It was about the fact that they had lived. The walls remembered their laughter, yes, their grief, certainly. But more than anything, the walls remembered their presence, the weight of them, the shape of them, the way their emotions had pressed against wood and seeped into corners. And now, those impressions, long dormant, had begun to realign, not for retrieval, but for recognition. Light had long ceased behaving like light. It no longer revealed. It participated. It filled shadows not to eliminate them, but to balance them. Within closets, under stairs, behind curtains long drawn and forgotten, there was no fear, no mystery, only presence, not of spirits or things unseen, but of memory resting where it had always been, too quiet to notice. And in this balanced presence, the house grew stiller, not as a pause, but as a gesture, like a breath at the edge of speaking, or a touch withheld not out of reluctance, but reverence. The journal no longer asked to be read. It was the reading, the act and the object, the witness and the story. The house, in full stillness, had become its own narrator. Somewhere, everywhere, threads thickened, not with tension, with meaning. From cellar to eave, hallway to attic, the house became a fabric of recollection. Each nail held more than weight. It held choice. Each hinge carried more than motion. It carried passage. The doorways were no longer thresholds. They were memories with handles. And if one stood in the center of any room now, truly stood, truly stilled, one would feel not the echo of the past, but the harmony of the ever. because the house had ceased remembering in order to become remembrance itself. In the silence, even the dust adjusted its purpose. It no longer settled randomly. It traced lines, soft, invisible roots from shelf to frame, from doorknob to floorboard. These were not paths of neglect. They were paths of return. Each mote, suspended in stillness, seemed to drift toward a pattern too subtle for eyes, too ancient for design. And where they gathered, the house became more than shelter. It became a vessel of alignment, not for energy, not for history, but for coherence. The kind of coherence that turns chaos not into order, but into meaning. Every corner now curved inward, not architecturally, but emotionally. The spaces had begun to lean toward each other, not to collapse, but to listen. It was not the walls that held memory. It was the silence between them. And that silence was no longer empty. It was full, saturated, alive not with sound, but with the pulse of something whole. And in that fullness the journal remained, not as object, not as artifact, but as the still point around which all remembering turned. Stillness had matured into density, not weighty, not oppressive, dense with presence, as if every second the house had ever endured had been drawn inward and now rested in the hollows between beams, the seams between bricks. The house did not glow. It gathered, not light, not sound, but alignment. Where once there had been walls to divide and floors to separate, there now existed only continuity, a slow-breathing fabric of essence, pulled tight but not tense, like skin over something ancient, something aware. The journal no longer occupied the table. It inhabited it. The wood beneath it felt less like material, more like memory folded into form. The corners of the page curled slightly, not from age or humidity, but from knowing. They had become the edges of meaning, framing a center that refused to be written and yet contained everything that ever could be. In that center, not a word, not a symbol, but a presence, quiet, round, complete. It was not the journal that had been recording. It was the house. The journal was merely where the memory surfaced. The house itself was the ink, the pen, the silence between each stroke. Across every room, air had ceased to behave as air. It no longer moved in drafts or warmth. It lingered, not idle, intentional. It touched skin not with temperature, but with remembrance. Anyone entering would not feel heat or cold. They would feel familiarity, so deep it bypassed recognition. The sense that you had never been there, and yet had always been part of it. Even the corners of the house, once accustomed to shadows, now held a kind of lightless clarity. Nothing was hidden, not because it had been revealed, but because the house no longer required concealment. It was not declaring itself. It was simply whole. Somewhere beneath the deepest floor, where no architecture remained, something turned, not in movement, but in orientation, like a compass realigning to a truth it had always known but never faced. The house was no longer simply remembering. It was centering. Every beam, every layer of paint, every knot in the grain had become part of a single act of knowing, not recollection, not haunting, but anchoring. The journal had not summoned the house. The house had grown the journal. And now, as stillness deepened into shape, the shape no longer resembled a building. It resembled a truth, and the truth was not told. It was held. The walls no longer echoed. They received. Sound did not travel. It arrived and then stayed. A breath taken near the window would be felt in the stairwell. A shift in posture at the threshold would be known in the attic, not as noise, but as imprint. The house had become not a network, but a singularity, a place so focused on holding that it no longer differentiated between the held and the holder. It had collapsed distance, not in space, but in experience. And so, it no longer waited to be inhabited. It had begun to inhabit itself. There was no longer a past to recall. There was only a now that contained every before. The journal, long open, did not need to close. Its purpose was not to begin or end, but to remain. a still surface for an ongoing pulse. It did not seek to be read. It sought only to remain present, like the house, like the silence, like memory itself, not as story, but as structure. There's a silence so deep it no longer listens. It simply is. The house had entered that silence, not as absence, but as arrival. The kind of silence found in the center of cathedrals before they are built, or in the hollows of ancient trees that remember wind long gone. This silence did not wait for footsteps. It did not miss voices. It was complete. And in that completeness, the house no longer held stories. It had become the pause between all stories, the stillness that makes story possible. Not emptiness, invitation. The journal had not turned a page in hours, or days, or centuries. Time had flattened, then curved, then fallen away. The ink that never was had etched itself into wood, into walls, into the memory of air. There were no records now, only impressions, the kind that outlive paper, outlast telling. On the table the journal remained open, not blank, not full, but present. It had stopped needing to speak. The house no longer needed to be understood. It had passed beyond interpretation, beyond metaphor. It had ceased trying to mean anything, and in doing so, it had become meaning itself. The edges of rooms no longer ended. They diffused. Hallways did not lead anywhere. They curved back into awareness. A hand brushed along a windowsill, and the house knew not touch, but intention. The breath of space, the warmth of structure, these were not features. They were echoes of being. Even light no longer behaved like illumination. It fell across objects not to make them seen, but to affirm they had never been lost. What had once been hidden was not revealed. It was rejoined, recalled not as data, but as presence. The house did not recognize visitors. It recognized recognition itself. And that was enough. Deep within, not beneath, but within, a single point remained. Not a room, not a core, a condition. As if the entire house had folded itself into an awareness so precise it required no center. The journal, the walls, the silence, all of it now rested within that single condition. Stillness without pause, memory without effort, meaning without message. The house no longer waited to be named. It had become what naming is for. And in that final stillness, not a door closed, not a window breathed, but something aligned, as if every layer of story had exhaled and let go. No one arrived, no one left, and yet movement existed, not as footsteps or doors, but as the settling of truths once fragmented. The house no longer remembered in images, in sounds, in stories. It remembered in form. A nail rusted in a beam, a faint outline on faded wallpaper, the slant of afternoon light across an uneven floorboard. These were no longer remnants. They were grammar, the structure of presence, not narrative, not memory, just being, stitched through matter, threadless, but whole. There was nothing left to wait for, nothing left to revisit. The journal, once a portal, was now a mirror, reflecting nothing but the stillness of its reader. It offered no answers, no revelations. It only offered what had always been offered, a place to stop, a surface to see yourself in, not through reflection, but through stillness. And in that quiet mirror, the house rested, not asleep, not watching, just was, no ending, no closure, only continuity, without the need for beginning again. It begins again, not with a sound, not with a step, with awareness, soft, slow, like the moment just before waking, when the body has not moved, but something inside has already risen. The house did not call, it did not summon, and yet something came, not someone, not a visitor, just the presence of presence itself, like the echo of a memory that has not yet been made. It hovered, not in air, but in possibility. The walls, long accustomed to stillness, did not respond. They received, not as structure, as witness, and in that reception the house remembered not what had been, But what was about to be? Light touched nothing. And yet the house brightened, not with glow, with awareness. As if even the shadows had exhaled, as if the very idea of hiding had withdrawn. Beneath the floor, the air shifted, not through pressure, but through recognition. The house was not waiting for someone to return. It had already welcomed something back. The echo of a thought, the suggestion of form, the anticipation of presence. It did not know who. It did not know when. It did not need to. The door had not moved, but it was, in every way that mattered, open. And still the journal remained. Open, untouched, its page quiet, unstirred. But something had changed. The silence it carried was no longer still. It hummed, not audibly, not physically, but like warmth behind the ribs, like the hush of deep water just before a ripple. It did not write. It did not reveal, but it offered. It had become the moment before a story begins. Not the first word, but the space that allows it. The house did not lean in. It simply breathed. And in that breath, every board, every nail, every grain of wood trembled. Not in fear, not in tremor, but in memory. The kind of memory that hasn't happened yet but is already known. It is possible then that this house does not end. It simply circles, not back, not forward, but inward. Each moment folding into the next, not as chapters, but as echoes. The journal does not close. The story does not resolve. But the stillness deepens, and in that deepening, something begins again. The house was not empty. It had simply stopped declaring, like an old tree that no longer stretches upward because it has found the sky within. No footsteps came, yet the floors shifted, subtly, not from weight but from readiness, as if memory itself had turned its gaze inward and found not fragments, but form. The journal, still unmoved, did not wait to be read. It waited to be shared, not in words but in presence, and that sharing did not require a reader. It only required stillness. Somewhere beyond the frame, the world continued. Leaves rustled, clouds passed, shadows stretched. But within the house, time no longer applied. Not because it had stopped, but because it had been accepted. It had become part of the architecture. And in that timelessness, the house was not paused. It was whole. No longer a place to visit, no longer a vessel of past lives, but a still current. And in its current, something moved, not forward, not backward, just deeper. It did not need to be seen. It only needed to be noticed. And in that quiet recognition, it continued. The house no longer waited. It simply existed. But in that existence, there was a gravity, a pull that was not direction, not desire, but invitation. The kind of pull felt in dreams before waking, when something unseen calls not the body, but the self. This was no longer about memory. Memory implied distance. This was something else, proximity without touch, intimacy without history, as if the house had ceased being a witness and had become a mirror, one that did not reflect what was, but what had always been, beneath the surface of becoming. The journal remained still, but now its silence was not passive. It breathed, not with lungs, but with presence. The page did not glow, yet it warmed the room, not by light, but by openness. The house did not watch. It remembered by being remembered. And in that exchange, something began to thrum, not between objects, but through recognition. Somewhere, someone would pause outside its door, not to enter, not to question, but simply to exist near it. And in that pause, the house would extend not welcome, but reflection. The walls did not hold echoes. They absorbed the possibility of sound. They listened without ears, felt without surface. The wood no longer creaked. It resonated. The air no longer carried breath. It joined it. Each corner, each fold of fabric forgotten in the dark, each thread of dust suspended in stillness. None of it was decoration. None of it was evidence. It was all participation. The house had become a field, a presence in which form held no hierarchy. There was no center now, no edges, only convergence. Perhaps this is how stories end. Not with conclusions, but with convergence. The kind that cannot be written, because it does not move. It only arrives. The house was no longer asking to be seen. It had become what vision reaches for when eyes are closed. Not revelation, not answer, just stillness, deep enough to remember you before you remembered yourself. No sound entered, no wind stirred the curtains, and yet something moved, not in space but in understanding. The house had become an environment where perception no longer relied on senses. It required only nearness, like standing in a fog that does not obscure but simplifies. There was nothing to interpret, nothing to discover, only being. Being near enough for the self to dissolve into presence, and presence to dissolve into stillness. The journal no longer held meaning. It held the possibility of meaning, suspended like breath between thoughts. There was no room for narrative here, not because stories had ended, but because the need to tell them had softened. The kind of softening that comes when the truth is no longer something to prove, but something to live beside. The house was not sacred. It was not haunted. It was simply exact, a place where nothing extra remained. And in that bareness, there was fullness, not absence, not austerity, just enough. Nothing declared itself, nothing concluded. And yet, in the hush, there was something undeniable, a presence that did not demand belief, only acknowledgement. There are places that do not ask you to arrive. They already carry your arrival inside them, as if they had been waiting not for your body, but for your shape in stillness. The house was such a place. It no longer needed stories. It had shed narrative the way a tree sheds leaves, not to end something, but to allow something deeper to begin. The journal did not close. The air did not stir. And yet, meaning continued, not as message, not as metaphor, but as a presence that settled quietly into the spaces once occupied by expectation. The floor held no dust, but it remembered dust. The walls did not echo, but they remembered sound. The window did not reflect, but it remembered light. These were not memories in the way we understand them. They were textures, layers of silence pressed gently over time until time itself folded inward. And in that fold, there was no loss. There was only intimacy, like touching a stone warmed by a hand you never met, like standing in a shadow that perfectly fits your outline, even though you just arrived. Stillness deepened, but did not darken. The house was not withdrawing. It was returning, not to a previous form, but to a state before form had hardened into edges. Its boundaries softened, not in structure, but in certainty. It no longer needed to define itself, and in that letting go, it became something more precise than language. The journal remained where it had always been, and yet in the mind of the house, it had already passed through every hand that would ever touch it. It had already been read by silence, by breath, by the unseen. Perhaps the house was not built. Perhaps it was remembered into existence, a contour formed not by bricks and mortar, but by longing, by witness, by the pause before speech. No one stands in its rooms now, but no room is ever empty. Even absence has weight, and in that weight there is presence, the kind that lingers not because it was left behind, but because it never had to leave. It waits without waiting. It holds without holding. It knows without knowing how. And in that knowing, it becomes not a house, not a journal, but the space between. The house no longer held meaning. It was meaning, stripped of symbol, and in that reduction, it became pure. So quiet it could not be named, so precise it could not be denied. The journal had become like breath, essential, unnoticed, constant. It did not tell, it allowed. allowed the space for a reader not to interpret, but to dissolve the urge to narrate, to define, to complete. And in that dissolution came clarity, not in message, but in presence without form. No hand touched the journal, but it turned, not in motion, but in posture. It faced forward, even if no one stood before it. Its pages no longer waited to be filled. They simply opened, not as invitation, but as reflection. And what they reflected was not what had been written, but what had been felt, what had been held gently, without ever being said. There is a threshold beyond memory where form begins to loosen, not into forgetting, but into presence too vast to be held. The house had arrived there, not suddenly, not through change, but through surrender. Its windows did not see, its walls did not contain, and yet they were aware not in the way of minds or machines, but in the way an old forest is aware of footsteps, not by hearing them, but by remembering they have not yet happened. Time was no longer a line. It had folded into something circular, then into something softer, and finally into something altogether still. The house had become stillness without edge. Nothing marked the rooms, no frame, no floorboard, no sound. But each space knew itself, not by boundary, but by feeling. A corner was a hush, a hallway, a pause. The stairs were no longer a structure to ascend, but a rhythm to pass through. The journal remained. Its presence was now so quiet, it no longer needed to be seen to be real. It existed in the way warmth remains after a candle is blown out. Not heat, not glow, just the memory of light, lingering without asking to be noticed. Nothing moved, but everything acknowledged. The beams, the dust, the absence of footsteps, all participated in a stillness that did not silence, but contained. Contained what? Not voices, not histories, but resonance. The kind of resonance left behind when something sacred has occurred without spectacle. A child's breath in sleep. A thought too gentle to speak aloud. These were now the bricks of the house. Not the past, not memory, but the density of unspoken presence. Thick as dusk, soft as water, that remembers the shape of every hand that entered it. The journal, though untouched, had become a center. Not the center of the house, but of what the house had become. It no longer offered story. It offered pause. A space not to know, but to be known. Even those who never entered would somehow feel it. That, in a forgotten corner of the world, a place had ceased to demand meaning, and in doing so, had become meaning itself. Not grand, not holy, just precise, like the exact moment between two notes, where silence holds the weight of both. This was no longer a house, not even a journal, not even memory. It was the pause in the world's breath, where presence curls in on itself, not to disappear but to remain unshaken, unnamed, unmoved. And in that remaining, it held not stories, but the permission not to need them. Nothing else was required. Nothing else was missing. The silence did not deepen. It clarified. It was no longer a lack of sound, but a fullness that needed nothing added. Even emptiness had completed its work. The house had become a condition, not a place, not even a presence. A condition in which being could simply rest, without needing to know itself. And in that resting, all things slowed, not into sleep, but into shape. The shape of what remains when everything else is allowed to fall away. The shape of knowing without naming, of home, without return. There comes a moment, never planned, never marked, when presence ceases to be experienced, and simply becomes the air in which experience is no longer needed. The house had reached that moment. Or perhaps it had always been there, quietly, waiting for perception to soften enough to enter it. There was no light, and yet everything could be seen. Not with eyes, not with thought, but with a stillness that had forgotten the boundary between observer and observed. The journal no longer mattered, and yet it remained, precisely because it no longer needed to. It had become part of the quiet, the kind that doesn't hush, but dissolves the need to speak. Somewhere beneath what once was floor or earth or history, something held, not a secret, not a foundation, but an echo, one so subtle it could only be heard by stillness itself. The house did not answer it. It was the echo, a place not haunted by memory, but inhabited by the shape memory takes when no longer attached to names. The corners had stopped being corners. They had become pauses, not emptiness, not rest, just pauses, as though reality itself had taken a breath and decided not to exhale. Yet, nothing returned, because nothing had left. The house had become that which never goes anywhere, even when empty. Not a void, not a soul, not a symbol, but something more quiet than all of those, something like the center of gravity in a dream, the point around which everything moves, even if nothing touches. The journal, though untouched, had turned once more, not forward, not back, but gently inward, as if the page itself had realized it had always been the closing line. And in that line, never written, never spoken, there was no punctuation, no ending, just space. Space wide enough to carry all the stories never told. Space soft enough to hold every presence that had passed through without leaving a mark. Space silent enough to echo even thought. The house did not disappear. It did not remain. It simply folded into what it had always been, the place between. Even the idea of time had fallen away. There was no before, no after, only texture, the gentle grain of stillness brushing against something that had once been longing. It no longer mattered who had lived here or what had happened. The house did not preserve history. It released it into something that did not forget, but no longer needed to recall. A breath held so long it had become part of the lungs themselves. Not tension, not release, just the state in between. The journal was not a book anymore. It was a threshold, a quiet gate between what was spoken and what remained sacred by not being spoken at all. It would never be closed, because it had never been opened. And in that realization, something final passed, not with sound, not with gesture, but with weight, a final, weightless weight, the kind that settles not on the shoulders, but into the corners of the soul, the kind that does not burden, only stays. And so it remained, not waiting, not ending, just holding the hush where stories once began.